My guest today works right at the intersection of corporate reputation, strategic communications, and the systems that shape how organizations are understood and trusted. And yeah, as mentioned, a quick word on format. This is going to be a 30-minute conversation. I've already got way too many questions for 30 minutes, but we'll see how it goes. This is on the record. We'll be sharing the article and the webinar recording afterwards. And please do give us your questions, whether right now or at any point during the chat, and we'll look to bring those in and also at the end. So Elif is a communication strategist whose expertise spans the agency side, including Ogilvy and Edelman, as well as in-house, having built a corporate communications function from the ground up at Pladis, a multi-billion-dollar stacking company, before moving into data-driven reputation advisory at RepTrak. She's the author of The Two Clocks, which is how I first encountered you, Elif, and a framework which is developed and publishes independently in her own right. And I found that I was just rereading it again before this, and there's so much food for thought. So I'm really grateful to have you and speak to you. So yeah, just to get going, like The Two Clocks has clearly created conversation and struck a nerve. So tell us all about it. What was your inspiration, and why two clocks rather than one?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for inviting me to here. We were just talking, I think, an unreasonable amount of when it comes to AI and its impact on communication. So I really appreciate the conversation. And the origin of that, I guess you might think about most inventions come out of a personal frustration or a need. And the two clocks was no different. So I was looking generally to figure out where is the conversation when it comes to AI and communications? And I was kind of looking at the conversation that's mostly tactical. Content automation, monitoring dashboards, GEO, these are all useful, but not sufficient as a primary response. So I got increasingly frustrated by the fact that there wasn't any strategic approach to what AI is changing for communication. So I decided to one write myself, for example. So that was kind of the origin of it. And I guess in terms of why two clocks instead of one, so I would first of all, I think, paint the territory the framework sits on. So imagine right now, for example, you're gonna want to buy a car and you go to your AI assistant, which might be ChatGPT, which might be Claude, and then you say, okay, which vendors should I be considering? And the system would return to you a short list. And in my view, that short list is basically two things. So the first, it is a commercial gate that defines whether the company has made the cut. And second of all, it is a reputational shorthand that starts to impact stakeholder influence before the organization has even opened its mouth. Much of what kind of surfaces on what AI answers say is actually coming from surfaces that communication is involved in managing. So news coverage, third-party validation, corporate websites. So when you think about it, the function is already upstream of AI engines. And I think that brings a very new and important reputational mandate and, to be frankly, new license for communication leaders. So I would say that's kind of the positive side. And when you look at the news, we see a lot of critical news around AI adoption, AI-related restructuring. So as you can see, communication is needed, not less, but more in this accelerated system. So I would say this is kind of the positive part of the territory. But at the same time, the same technology is also automating the production work the industry has been historically measured on. So if your value is not upstream, meaning you're not shaping decisions, but merely communicating them, you're not managing risks, you're not bringing the voice of stakeholders that are not in the room, that's a big ethical and I say existential threat for organizations. So the kind of framework sits on that basis. And the why not one but two clock is basically, the principle is quite simple. In my view, I think communication is running two clocks. So the first one is outward facing. It's the operational demands of monitoring, content creation, reputation measurement in the AI mediated world. And the second one here is structural. It's inward facing. It is, what do you need to become if you're a communication professional or a function, and how does your value gets measured? And it is my my theory that most communication leaders are deferring the structural clock and focusing on the immediate clock. And I think this is self-defeating, because this is where mandate compression begins, because you are basically ending up with territory you cannot occupy because you have not redesigned yourself. So this is the whole basis of the framework, and it runs through five dimensions. The first one is about the measurement gap I just touched upon. So it is looking and having an honest review of, okay, where is my value proposition is, and where there's kind of output within that gravitational pull of that output, where am I? And answering that strategic intent question, what do I exist in this AI mediated world to do? And the second one here is about redesigning from that intent, not pressure, because most of the functions are going to use AI to do the same thing faster. So the redesign principle is different. It is aiming to gain a strategic capacity through automation and redeploying it strategically, both in what you do as communications, but also how does your value gets measured. And the third one is about the value of basis of communication being changing. So reputation, obviously management is important, a relationship capital, editorial judgment, all of them are still important, but I think two primary things needs to come next to it. The first one is obviously AI knowledge, not necessarily enough to build, but enough to understand and challenge governance decisions. And the second one here is about risk fluency applied to machines and not only people. So that will be the kind of the inward work, the structural work. And the other two, I know we're going to talk a bit more in the kind of later in the discussion, but they are more about the reputation mediation piece. The signal architecture is basically looking at the image AI paints about your organization and see if it tells one or multiple stories. And the final one is trust consequence, which is what kind of unique contribution that communication would bring to the AI governance and reputation management.
Yeah, and I was going to say, like, when you come to that, so the five dimensions, if I get this correctly, is strategic intent, function redesign, capability base, signal architecture, and trust consequence. So for somebody who's hearing this for the first time, which of those five do you find that leaders are most likely to skip, and why would that be?
I would say the first three are the strategic piece, the structural piece, what it is that you have to become to be able to meet the needs of the AI function. So I would basically say the first one, which is easiest to skip, is the strategic intent, because this is where you have to have an honest look at what you do. No one wants to admit, obviously, if your value proposition is output based. So that's an honest look, because a lot of the leaders might kind of realize when they do that audit that mix is not where they want it to be. So you have to look at that and be able to be willing to deconstruct it. This is where I think a lot of the leaders will push. So in actually, my opinion is that a lot of the leaders might ignore the strategic clock, not because of lack of bandwidth or I think capability, but both of these clocks require the leaders to be vulnerable in two different directions at the same time. For the, I would say, immediate clock, the reputation management piece requires the communication leader to show up as a technology and sophisticated risk thinker, not just for people, but systems. And we know that's not a profile a lot has embodied yet. That's one way of vulnerability. And the structural clock that we're talking about requires the leader to look at that value proposition, honest one, not where we want it to be, dismantle it under scrutiny visibly and create a new one. And I think most leaders are going to live with the vulnerability they can manage, which is the first part, growing into that systems and risk thinking role, because that's a socially acceptable one.
And something I found quite evocative was that you said that the structural clock asks the leader to shed skin, to dismantle the function and the existing value and rebuild it. So what does that actually look like in practice?
So I would say, first of all, there is a human component of things. I think this is something we miss quite a lot in the AI discussion. So what do I feel as a human when it comes to AI? So the measurement gap, for example, the production identity is something the function has been carrying for such a long time. And a good example I always give is about crisis mitigation. So, for example, you want to try to prevent a crisis from happening. You do. So your KPI is 0, but you walk into your CEO's office and you have nothing to show for because the lack of something doesn't have a natural metric. So I think there's a gap that all communication people all know too well about what you need to be measuring, which is your actual added value, which is sense making, second order risk thinking, representing the voices of stakeholders that are not in the room, but you know what you want to be measured on, but you are actually measuring the outputs, the opportunity to seize the campaign outputs. So I think that's going to require a hard look at, okay, where is my value proposition is, and deconstructing that. And I would say at that point, you have to shed skin. And I think more than that, it's an identity change. If you build your entire identity based on, for example, primarily editorial judgment, relationship capital, which are still important, don't get me wrong, they are still what makes us human, what makes us unique. And they should be a few of the signals among many. They're not enough anymore when it comes to the AI mediated world. So that would what I mean. We need to kind of look at the current identity, maybe mourn it, and then reconstruct a new one, because the value of basis for communication is changing. And if you consider reputation capital, for example, or your editorial judgment as irreplaceable moats, you are basically investing in the older value model at the expense of engaging with the new one.
Yeah, I was just going to say the measurement gap that you speak out about is something that's particularly pertinent for me. Like recently, as in like just earlier this week, I was producing a H2 2026 plan for a client all around digital and social media that we developed, and a lot of that has been specifically produced from a crisis comms perspective of looking to avoid potential issues. And how you prove that and then look to potentially get retained business and charge for that can be a bit of a challenge, shall we say? And I think it always is.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you're touching upon an important point, which is what does that mean for the partners of communication? So this is because something that impacts not just in-house teams, but anyone who's working with or alongside communication, which means PR and communication agencies. So the way I see that divide is the same clock applies for everyone. So if you, for example, that measurement gap that AI did not create but exposes, is the same thing for agencies as well. So if you look at your value proposition and it's mainly based on outputs and billing hours around outputs, I'd say the same clock applies to you, but it runs faster, because if you're an in-house team, you obviously have all of those structural clock legacy assets that you bring, that sense making, risk management. So the clock is slower, I would say, for an in-house team. But if you're an agency, you might be the budget item that gets cut. So I would have the same look at your value proposition to be able to figure out, okay, where your value is. If you're selling time, I would say the first of all is about also the organizations, the partners on integrity as well. So if you now are able to do work that cost you 5 hours in 1 hour, I think you have to bring that discussion to the client before it arrives to you. And it's not going to be pleasant, but it's going to be necessary to be able to have a change management through it. And what I see is we see the big consultancies moving towards outcome-based pricing, the McKinseys of the world, for example. So you have a portion of your compensation that's upfront. The other one is tied to the outcomes, whether it's cost saving, whether it's bottom line. I'd say that's the right instinct. But for communication, there's a catch. You can only gain share on something you can measure. And currently, what do we measure? We measure outputs. And if you try to gain share within that, you're basically trying to do that in a shrinking pool against the machine that's increasingly getting better. So my theory is whoever's able to establish that attribution infrastructure, meaning the causal proof of this particular communication work has driven that particular commercial outcome, is going to be able to gain share and be able to price accordingly like the consultancies, while the rest, I think, is going to be stuck in trying to gain share in that effectiveness and efficiency piece that's getting a lot better with AI. So that will be my point of view. And the final one is, I think your business might look different than what you have been doing. There might be new value propositions. Maybe the structural clock, which is what the in-house function needs to become, maybe that's going to be something the agencies also help with. Maybe rather than providing the output, maybe you help work with them to create that infrastructure in-house, but your scale and value becomes something else. So I think it's also important to be open-minded to, okay, what new value propositions I might bring to the table.
Yeah, I was actually about to say that I'd read, I think it was just yesterday, an article about how more agencies and organizations are shifting from the kind of hourly and daily pricing to values based. And I've worked at places that have done both before. So it's interesting to see that shift take place on a wider basis. And actually, I was just about to ask about this as well. Was one of we're both just at the PR for AI conference, which I really enjoyed and got a lot out of. And there's actually a question that's in the asked at the conference that stayed with me, and that was when they said that their client had come to them and said, "Well, we can effectively do what you do using AI tools now, so why do we need you?" Like, or that sort of quite provocative question. And I think the answer, not to paraphrase the speaker, I think was around instead of combating that or kind of pressing against it, to figuring out how to work with them and something that could be more of a consultancy model, but just a different way of working. And that's something that definitely within the two clocks you speak about as well, is the fact that I think you propose or you talk about potential new role positions or ways in which roles can shift.
Yeah, definitely. So I say AI is increasingly getting good at removing friction or
Hmm.
execution. So if as an agency your only value proposition is friction removal or incremental execution, I'd say just like in-house teams, you need to take a hard look at your value proposition and figure out how you can pull it upstream. And it's going to be a journey. And I agree with not putting your head in the sand. We can't avoid the very palpable question that was raised at the conference. It's exactly what the clients are thinking because they are having the same question. Their CFO is walking in saying, do we need this many teams? How are you implementing AI? What efficiency are getting? So they are merely cascading the pressure that is coming. So I think ignoring that's not going to work. This is where I was getting at when it comes to the value proposition being changing. Maybe one of your job is going to help the client build that infrastructure, but also I kind of really genuinely believe that it's not that equal. The cost of replacing a task or a role does not equal the subscription fee of an AI assistant. There is a lot of work. In many cases, we see AI creating more work, different type of work, and there are examples of it. So the efficiency is yet to be proven. So, or in Ford's case, is non-existent. I'm sure you have seen the news where Ford announced that they have rehired 350 engineers, so they need
Yeah.
to redesign the AI design tools and also somewhat fix, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, what AI has broken. So I think there is a learning curve to demonstrate that it's not an equal. Even if you downgrade it to a bottom line approach, a human doing a role might end up being a lot budget friendly. And I would say in terms of the roles that you discussed, that goes into the new capability base of the framework. So I'd say those are some of the roles that are not currently, I say, existent in the actual market stance. But one of them would be, which I'd love to talk a bit more about on the two reputation kind of management dimensions of the framework. But one of them is AI agent briefer, for example. That will be something that's not in the sense this is still present in the roles that you would see, but that's something I think that's going to come. Or coherence judgment, for example, reputation risk modeler to machines and not people. So I think AI is going to also apply or maybe call in the upstream qualities communication have to upstream roles, which is around, again, how do you manage a trust consequence when you have an agent that's speaking on behalf of a company? What does the risk architecture look like when there is not a human on the other end of the line, for example?
Hmm. I was going to say, like, particularly, and we'll move to other elements as well. I was just going to ask when it comes to the structural clock, like, have you seen, or what would you say are the types of things that comms leaders have done well when they've addressed that uh, properly?
Yeah, so the way I would say, I still I still see the immediate clock being prioritized, and that's a rational response to, I'd say, incentive structure. This is where the actual risk is, where the CEO is watching, where the functions' existing credentials are being built. So I'd still see that being prioritized over time. And in this discussion as well, we're going to focus more on, for example, that signal architecture and trust consequence part of it. So that's a reality. I would say the ones that are doing well is at least ring fencing at least 10% of your time and efforts, not on the next tool, but what you need to become as a communication leader and what a function needs to become. I think the leaders who are able to hold at least that minimum 10% are actually, I think, ahead of the game rather than just only focusing the day to day and the immediate clock's demands.
Mhm. And you just talked about signal architecture. There are references that we're going to chat about that, so let's do so. Because this is when it comes to signal architecture, trust and AI governance, I find it's in many ways the most substantial area to talk about and consequential as well. So, signal architecture and trust consequence are two dimensions people understand least, I'd say, in my own opinion. What do both those terms mean in a kind of day-to-day sense?
Yeah, so signal architecture is about managing your reputation on the AI engines themselves, I would say. And I think for understanding that, we need to also look at what has changed. So in my view, AI is not just changing how information is distributed, but it is changing how organizations are interpreted. When you think about it, persuasion is no longer starting from a blank page, but it's starting from a machine-made baseline. And that's a massive structural change. And I'd say communication has been built for a relational world. You can correct an employee, you can mediate something with an investor. AI introduces, I'd say, structural asymmetry. You cannot mediate with it. You cannot change its answer real time in a way that changes what it says to the next person who asks. So I would say that in a world where AI sits between you and all of your other important audiences, and if it's mediating, one layer is mediating all the other layers, I'd say reputation management becomes not relational, but architectural. And I think that requires a new mandate, which leads me to signal architecture. So it is basically, in a sense, looking at the surfaces AI ingests, looking at the reputational shorthand it creates, and to see if it's talking about one single picture or many of them. And right now, I would say the question is more focused on visibility. We discussed that the surfaces that communication managers already show up heavily on AI engines, news coverage, third-party validation on websites. From there on, I guess the first question has become visibility. So are we visible to the tool? But my question is, visibility is a starting point. That's my argument. You can be visible to an AI engine, meaning accurately represented, but you cannot still, maybe you may not still make the cut. So the organizations, in the example I have given about you looking to buy a car and receiving a short list, is made up of organizations not necessarily most visible, but most eligible. So the harder question is eligibility, meaning whether the organization's signals are credible enough to be selected. So that architecture is basically looking at that. And in terms of what communications role is, I would say that leans onto a bit of governance as well. So that whole picture, first of all, is volatile, is not one picture. So ask twice, you get a different answer. Ask one engine, ask the other, you get a different engine, so different answer. So you're managing not just one, but a range of interpretation. And that total picture, I think the governance gap is doesn't have a single owner. Communication kind of manages the corporate voice, corporate communication. Marketing manages brand. You have investors who manages investor relations. Each is doing its own work on its own surface to its own stakeholder logic. What nobody does is reading the whole. And I think that was manageable before because you can correct things. You have relationships with people and you didn't have an intermediary capable enough of reading that whole, summarize it, and handed it over to anyone who asked. So I'd say that inconsistency was always there, but it wasn't never this costly. So I think that's kind of the governance gap that communication is catering in on. And the other factor to take into consideration is about how narratives show up in AI systems. So you might be telling, okay, this is the best shoe in the world or the best airline. Ned B. Jones sees the AI strategist. He talks a lot about that. If anyone who's interested, I totally recommend them take a look. So that statement might entice a human because you might want to have the best, but it does nothing to a machine. The machine is basically telling you, don't tell me, show me. So you have to have substantial evidence underneath that brand narrative, which I call the truth layer role. I'd say communication is perfectly capable of playing that role. That kind of fact-checking, proofing, sourcing kind of muscle is highly useful communication people. So that's what I would sum it up is. There is a role to look at reading the whole, first of all, that nobody does. That's a communication work. Looking where it holds, keeping an active map of that because it is changing, and convening that cross-functional alignment group, because as I mentioned, that surface, that image is being inputted by many of the functions. So looking at it, keeping a track of it, and when it actually doesn't say what you want it to say, convening that cross-functional alignment and doing what's necessary, I'd say is the signal architecture role for communications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. And when I was reading the framework, there was a line that kind of stuck with me, and I've just got it here, so I get it right, where it said, "Persuasion no longer starts from a blank page; it starts from a machine-made baseline," which is in many ways slightly terrifying. But then
Yeah.
also, as communicators, then we have to acknowledge the realities of this and kind of shift to that kind of way of thinking, I guess.
Yeah, precisely. And I'd say there are a lot of correlations between standard communication work and how that might apply. So for this particular occasion, I would also consider the stakeholder discovery, something communication discipline is very, very familiar with. So when there is a new stakeholder in the picture, you would get to know them. You would understand what makes them tick. What do they value? What do they currently know about you? Is the picture one that you want to have? I'd say that principle can transfer to AI, not entirely, because then that discovery is mechanical, it's not relational. But that whole principle of mapping the stakeholder, understanding what it values, correcting things that does not fit the story you want to tell, I'd say it's something that's familiar to communications. But for that, obviously, for the discovery questions to be answerable, you need AI literacy, I'd say, and fast. And again, not enough to build, but enough to govern the system. You can't govern something you can't understand.
Yes. And when it comes to the issue of trust, we had a question come in, and actually it relates to something I was going to, yeah, anecdote that I had. But the questions around as stakeholders increasingly assume AI is everywhere and everything they read. What happens to trust, and what does that ask of communicators? And what I was just going to ask myself is very related to that, and I've seen, tangible examples of communications taking place between two people where it's obviously AI generated in both fronts. So there's that slight corrosion of what is this and what are we doing? So
I
yeah, so what do you think does happen to trust in the kind of time that we live in, and what does it ask for us as communicators?
I think that's a really good segue to the trust consequence dimension that I talked about, which is entirely about that AI governance piece. So the way I think about it is, I think communication is the organization's slow thinker. You would know from Daniel Kahneman's fast and slow thinking. So you have a fast thinking, which is our kind of monkey brain. It's instinctive. It takes over during a crisis. And you have the slow thinking, which I call the governance committee here on the prefrontal cortex. I consider communication as that slow thinker of the organization, and in a system where everything's accelerated and you don't have a human necessarily, but you have a machine on the other end of the line. I think communication has a unique role. First of all, the reason for that is communication is the only function whose object is coherence. It has no stake in how AI works. When you think about it, for example, IT or chief AI officer focus is, for example, adoption velocity. Marketing looks at brand. Communication only looks to see whether that picture holds. So that independence, coupled with this horizontal role in the organization, having shared surfaces with departments, I think gives it its unique altitude. So the first thing I would say communication's role is about understanding that trust consequence in design period, not after systems fail. So I think that will be, first of all, the first role I would draw. The second one here is when it comes to reputation and risk management. So when there's a crisis, communication can usually work backwards. Someone has made a decision in a certain context. You can work backwards, and that is the basis of your risk and reputation and issue management principle. But AI breaks that chain increasingly. For example, what you're mentioning is happening. The consequence might come within the system. What is it? For example, prompt injection, a hallucinated output, and a lot faster than governance can intervene. So I would say that goes back to the literacy piece, to be able to understand how within that probabilistic, I think, world, trust is built or lost. I say reputation is built with one token at a time. I think it's so true for our time, to be able to, I think, update your view and risk muscle, especially for the agentic world that we discussed. For example, what happens when right now everyone's concerned about what an engine says because there is someone else on the end of the line? What happens? There is also agent versus agent, which is an interesting category for communication. I would say agents are becoming your operational spokespeople, which is kind of, I think, a very important critical role communication would play. So when you think about it, communication trains spokespeople for high stakes, low frequency environments. So there is a interview, there's a press conference, it's not every day, and it's high stakes. Agents change that. Are you going to be talking on behalf of a company all day, every day? And they need to be briefed as such, because a lot of the time, the operational configuration is there. The basic security measures are, of course, there for an agent that's well configured, but reputation protocol is missing. What does that say when someone asks, well, I hear your CEO has involved in a controversy. What do you say about that? That requires not a blind, I can't answer this question. That requires an actual reputational lens that needs to be applied to it. And also, media train the agents, for example. That's a brand new role. You would never let your spokesperson sit on an interview before you ask them the difficult questions. Ask the difficult questions from a reputation lens. Again, they probably are asking, the IT is asking that operational question, but the reputation lens is missing. So I would say communications role is understanding AI enough to map out those trust consequences, being part of that governance discussion in design, not after they fail, and also figuring out how does that risk muscle carries over to agentic world. As I mentioned, agents becoming spokespeople is one example.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think you had me going down a bit of a philosophical rabbit hole with the idea of agents as company spokespeople. And then when I started thinking about it, it kind of cast my mind back to earlier days producing websites and social media channels and whether those in themselves, and then working with chat, all sorts of things. But before I get lost within that, I want to pause and say, if people have questions, we've got 10 minutes left at the moment. And I also noticed that there was a comment from Kerry in the chat as well, who says, totally agree, Elif. In the upcoming CIPR CCN Crisis Comms Board Guide, I positioned it as you can't defend what you have not governed, and you can't govern what you do not understand, which feels a very, yeah, again, very related to what you're discussing.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is the first point. And yes, that discussion is going to include technical requirements, but communication was able to adapt to all of the technical disruptions in history. I'd say there is potential to be able to do that, but leaders have to be intentional on it rather than just let that happen to them.
And I'm going to ask a couple more questions as well. I've got loads of questions actually, but I'll try and stick to a couple because we've got limited time. But when an organization is deciding how it governs AI, what the unique contribution communications should be making to that conversation, um, and is comms actually being invited into the room? What's your thoughts around how we can achieve this? Both as, we'll have people here who are maybe one person consultants, small agencies, medium, larger size. So what do you think are the kind of fundamentals that we should be like in the front of our minds?
So I would first of all say it depends on the size of the organization. On big enterprises, we obviously see the chief AI officer role being established and expanding with an expanding mandate that goes beyond technical and also into organizational design, change management, and around it there's a recognizable core. You have a review board that includes IT, legal, compliance, HR, increasingly because of employee adoption, and communication is most often missing. So the first point would be to explore how is AI governed currently or not in your organization. Who is responsible? In a big organization, that's easy to find. Maybe depending on the size of it, it might be maybe one person. Maybe there's IT, legal, and the CEO or CFO is running this. So I would say, first of all, understanding where that is. The second one is asserting your role, but by demonstrating the unique value propositions, which are the things I mentioned. First of all, looking at decisions that look fine from every direction, but bringing that trust consequence. The fact that communications only object is coherence, so it has no stakes in AI, and any department who has a stake in it cannot mark their own homework. So that independence is the unique value proposition you bring, and also communication is the only function that can read the way you adopt AI, its implications, economical, environmental, governance, staff, is a reputation signal in itself, including what you say to your colleagues, as in why you're adopting it, what do you expect from them, and what you say to the outside world. All of them are reputational signals. So communication is the only department that knows the difference between compliance and reputational coherence. So I would bring those unique values that you can bring to the table to assert your role. And also I'd say that seat's not going to be given to you. You have to earn your keep, I would say, and that goes through by understanding the system enough to challenge decisions in design, not after they fail.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, since you published the framework, which are the responses that have surprised you, or where do you find people have responded the most?
So I would say what I see is the immediate clock is still being prioritized. This is exactly why we're having this conversation as well. So the signal architecture, looking at the kind of signals AI ingests on the surfaces it ingests and managing the coherence of that, the governance, trust, consequence piece, especially in Europe, these are a lot more important because there is greater focus and regulation here, and the EU AI Act is coming. So I'd say that governance piece, risk mitigation are the primary focuses, especially in Europe. But I would say again, the irony is what I say, communication is what surprises me is a function whose professional identity is based on second order risk thinking ahead of the problem. And I think it applies that logic or muscle rarely towards itself. So I'd say what gets missed and what's the most important thing, that second order thinking's application is to what is coming through communication itself, meaning not missing the structural clock.
Yes. Yeah, I think with communications, we're always looking around the corner. And right now, it feels like the corner is almost like closer than ever and trying to kind of peer around. We've got a question here from Robert, or a couple of questions. So he says, what I always wonder about is the existence of AI changing the nature of comms itself. It's one thing to have a key message, but once that key message can be interrogated well by free tools, are they all that useful anymore? And then his second question, is reputational coherence even necessarily possible for everyone and everywhere?
So what I would say, the first one goes back to using AI strategically. Right now, AI can be strategically deployed in what you do. What can that be? For example, upload. Communication usually does what I call stitch metrics. You would look at maybe website traffic, you would look at your news coverage, social media, and you would stitch those to tell a story about the success of what you have done. AI is amazing at that. So all that fragmented data you have, you are able to put together a more coherent piece, I would say, on what your added value was. That will be the first thing, for example, to use AI. The second one is about the scrutiny you mentioned. So messaging and message testing and simulations, especially crisis. We are hearing a lot about digital twins, for example. I think that's a very, very good idea to be able to stress test your messaging against audiences that might give you a relatively good idea on where it might land and help you expand your risk horizon. I would say using AI strategically to that, but also the attribution piece is very huge. Right now, I think the same technology that's disrupting AI can also help you to demonstrate your added value. What it is, again, this is the communication piece of work I have done. That was its impact on an actual commercial outcome. So that causal relationship is something that's being invested on. There are tools that are kind of coming into the market. So I would say using AI to change what you do, how you do it, and also how you get measured on. Within that includes message testing is important. The second one here, reputation is a long-term game. So AI, I think, just added an infrastructure. First of all, I think communication leaders needs to realize this is not a channel, it's an infrastructure. It's a brand new way people are getting information and already shaping their views about organizations before you as an organization has said anything. Or your media relations has become triangle, for example. It used to be bilateral, but now the journalist might be talking to the AI before it even comes to your door. So what it is that you have to offer to a journalist, for example, that AI cannot offer. So I think we need to be realistic about the ground. What I would keep in mind is, I think this question is more about, for example, AI reputation management, and that goes into, for example, generative engine optimization. That's a moving ground. It's very volatile and it has a lot of noise and inconsistency. The way I would answer that is, AI values and rewards what good reputation strategy always built. What it is: authority, consistency, trust. So I would look to try to manage reputation at the input level, not at the output level. Output would be looking at, okay, what is AI spitting out about me? Input is what kind of signals feeds that picture. So I would start the reputation journey there. And you're not going to have perfection, and it's a very moving ground. Each day the models are in competition with one another to make updates. So I'd say it's going to be a moving journey. 100% excellent is not possible, but the same principle, again, know what you want to be known for. Make sure your messages are consistent, readable, and accessible through the machine. I'd say that strategic principle still holds.
Yeah, certainly. I was going to say just one practical thing that I've started doing. I use Claude Cowork a lot at the moment, and I've started scheduling every month. So 1st of July, I get a flurry of updates, and I have various kind of stress tests taking place across things that I do, including around messaging. And if it's reviewing everything that I've done, does this all feel consistent? Is there anything that sticks out? So there's definitely ways in which these tools, not to replace the human eye, but can definitely do
Okay.
things in a way that helps me as somebody with very limited time. Just going to do one quick question because I'm worried we've got 1 minute left. And I always like to end with kind of practical takeaway. So if somebody has been watching, and thanks everybody who's joined the conversation, somebody watching this changes one thing, what would you want that to be?
One thing. Can I have two? The first one would be, because strategic, I'd say the value of basis for communication is changing. I think if you do on the structural, I'll give one on both of the clocks. The first one on the structural is, again, the value of basis, the basis of value for communication is changing. I'd say figure out what do you exist in this world to do, and how does that get measured slash priced. That would be the first thing. Second one here is, I think, start at the practical. If you're going to start, for example, with AI reputation management, figure out which questions your stakeholders might ask. Ask them to the favorite AI assistant you have, because there is no such a thing as one AI. Each of them are different in one kind of information ecosystem. So start small. Maybe gather your questions, ask it to an agent, and see if there's a gap between what it says and what you want it to say. So that would be, I guess, the kind of advice on the immediate clock I would leave with.
Thank you very much. I've got, I just want to read, there's a final comment from Kristen, who says, I'm so excited to see comms finally being able to force and measure certain digital marketing, and can never understand why we don't embrace that accountability. Comms is powerful, we shouldn't be afraid, which I think is also a great note to end the conversation on. So I just wanted to thank you so much, Elif, and everybody else who's joined us.